Hello, YouTubers. Well, many think that the Abomination of Desolation refers to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, or an act done by the Antichrist. I take a different view, one that you might not have heard. I briefly touched on this subject in a previous video entitled, Is Daniel's 70th Week Referring to Jesus or the Antichrist? Upon greater reflection and a comparison of passages between the English Standard Version and the King James Version, I can see the theological consistency of viewing Daniel's 70th week as a future reference to the Antichrist. I'm much closer to being fully persuaded that the Abomination of Desolation is not something in the past, but it is for the future, because the Bible translation I trust the most seems to confirm it. It should be noted that, concerning the Abomination of Desolation, there are some big differences between the English Standard Version and the King James Version. I'll make the case that, if the English Standard Version is correct, the Abomination of Desolation is another title for the Antichrist, or that it is an act that gives the Antichrist power. Not that the Abomination of Desolation is an act of profaning the temple that is done by the Antichrist. For the people who are alive as the Antichrist rises to power, the difference probably doesn't mean much. However, I find the issue to be important when studying Bible prophecy. First, let's be clear about what the Abomination of Desolation isn't referring to. There's no way that the Abomination of Desolation could refer to any event or person prior to Christ. It's also highly unlikely that the Abomination of Desolation was referring to Christ, because Jesus said plainly that the Abomination of Desolation was, at the time of his speaking, a future event. So those who make the case that the Abomination of Desolation is referring to Antiochus Epiphanes, who reigned well before Christ was born, are flat out wrong. Jesus would not warn people to watch out for something or someone that happened in the past. I also submit that the Abomination of Desolation cannot be referring to the events in Jerusalem in AD 70. Why? Well, because Jesus said that the days of the Abomination of Desolation also consist of a tribulation so terrible that there is nothing to compare it to since the creation of the world. So look, the Christians in Rome experienced bad tribulation for sure, but I think that there have been several times in history where Christians have experienced at least as bad of persecution as what was experienced by the Christians in the Roman Empire. For example, Mao Zedong was the biggest mass murderer in all of human history. He killed 45 million people, many of them Christian. Another reason that I think it is referring to a future event is because Christians that lived after the destruction of Jerusalem said that it wasn't referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. For example, Hippolytus, who lived approximately 100 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, clearly stated that it is referring to a future event. Perhaps the strongest argument that the Abomination of Desolation is referring to a future event that takes place near the end of time is found in Daniel 12. Why is this chapter the best evidence for a future Abomination of Desolation? Because the chapter repeatedly states that the prophecy refers to the time of the end, during the time of the resurrection and the time of trouble that has never existed until that time. I submit that it is this passage that Jesus is actually referring to in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, rather than Daniel 9. That's because, when referencing the Abomination of Desolation, Jesus specifically mentioned the Great Tribulation that is associated with it. It is this chapter where both of those events are found. So it may be possible that Daniel's 70th week is referring to Christ, but that chapters 11 and 12 are referring to the Antichrist. However, as already noted, the early Christians that lived after the destruction of the temple took the view that Daniel's 70th week was referring to a future event, so perhaps so. Let's look in more detail at the passages concerning the Abomination of Desolation found in chapters 11 and 12. Daniel 11:31 renders, "Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate." So, if you notice, it doesn't say that the profaning of the temple and fortress is the Abomination of Desolation. Rather, it says forces from him profane the temple and also set up the Abomination of Desolation. So this verse seems to indicate that it is not the Antichrist that profanes the temple, but his followers. The passage concerning Daniel's 70th week also agrees with this view, since it states that it is the people of the prince who will come who will profane the temple, rather than the prince himself. However, when they profane the temple, this act will also set up the Abomination of Desolation, which means that the Antichrist will be given power and authority at that time. It is only after the temple is profaned that the Antichrist takes a seat in the temple. 2 Thessalonians indicates this. It states in chapter 2, verse 3, "For that day will not come, unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction." I submit that the rebellion is when people rebel against God by profaning a newly rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Perhaps what's most perplexing is that, according to the English Standard Version, Jesus said that the abomination of desolation was a person, obviously the Antichrist, rather than an event that causes his rise to power. In the earliest gospel, Mark, Jesus is to have said, "But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." So Jesus directly referred to the abomination of desolation as a person, rather than an event. However, the King James Version renders something different. It states, "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." So, in the King James Version, Jesus is to have referred to the abomination of desolation as a thing or an event, since the word "it" is used. On the other hand, a parallel passage to Mark, found in Matthew 24, renders the same in both the English Standard Version and the King James Version. It states, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." In this passage, Jesus isn't saying that the abomination of desolation is an act performed by the Antichrist. He's saying, when you see the abomination of desolation in the holy place. So he was using the title abomination of desolation as the title for the Antichrist, basically saying, when you see the Antichrist standing in the temple, rather than that the abomination of desolation is an act performed by the Antichrist. So putting all this together, what can we learn? Well, the Bible strongly indicates that the abomination of desolation is referring to a future event where people rebel against God and profane the temple, giving rise to the Antichrist, or could possibly be a title for the Antichrist himself. While I can't say for sure which it is, I hope that this video sheds some light on the subject. I think what's clear is that the abomination of desolation isn't referring to an act in the past, nor is it referring to an event that the Antichrist does, but is instead referring to an act by the people. That's all the time I have for now. If you like this video, please show your support by subscribing. Thanks for your time.